Well, hey everyone, before I get into today's sermon, I just want to give you a quick thank you to Grace Church for your financial generosity. In my 30 years here now, we've always been a church who understood the power of giving, and I just want to urge us to keep going. There's still work to be done ahead of us. And over the years, every time that Kim and I have made the choice to be generous, especially in the times that it stretched us, it's been such an adventure of faith for our family. And as we step into this new era as a church, mobilizing more and more people to live out God's story every day, everywhere, I'm reminded that generosity isn't just about dollars, it's about stories. And because of your continued financial faithfulness, our church is writing beautiful stories together. Every gift you give echoes into someone's life, and it becomes food for a family and hope for someone struggling and a salary for a pastor in a third world country and tangible expressions of God's love to people and kids. Every dollar you've generously shared is creating ripples of change that reach further than you'll ever see. If you're not in this generosity game with us, man, I would just encourage you to get on board. It is such an adventure. And if you are today, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to thank you. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for trusting God enough to give, to serve, to love through your generosity. We couldn't do any of this without you. So keep shining His light, church. You're making a difference beyond measure.
Let's pick up where we left off in this greatest of stories, following Jesus through His final days in Jerusalem, learning alongside the disciples that His blood must be poured out for many, and that the good news of His resurrection must be proclaimed to the whole world. Join us as we journey with Jesus to the cross and beyond the Gospel of Mark.
Well, it was a kangaroo court and a man who faced a terrible dilemma, one that would change history. The hearing happened early in the morning, probably between 6 and 7 a.m. The legal apparatus of the day liked to start early and finish early to give themselves plenty of time for recreation in the afternoon. And Jesus had been arrested sometime around midnight on the night before, Thursday night. He had a hearing before the religious leaders and then the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, and they tried to pin a charge of blasphemy on him. Blasphemy was punishable by death, and that's really what they wanted, an execution. But there was only one hitch. The Jews would condemn a man to death, but they couldn't carry it out. The Romans had taken that right away from them. So before Jesus could be put to death, Pilate, the Roman governor, had to agree to it. Which is why early on Friday morning, they brought Jesus to the Praetorium, the judgment hall, the place where the governor would hear cases and render verdicts. The religious leaders were all there, and the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, all of them, everyone Jesus had ticked off for the past few years. And they had Jesus with them, bound up like a criminal. And this is the first time Jesus is now appearing, not before the religious establishment, but before the political establishment. Pilate will ask 3 questions. And the answer to these questions will not only impact history, but they're going to impact your future as well. What do I mean by that? Well, before we continue the story, let me shift the scene from ancient times to modern times. Your living room, your cubicle at work, your favorite coffee shop. And as we're here in the modern era, we're aware of all the evils of the world. Like you take in all the news of the day, and it couldn't be clearer. All is not right with the world. In fact, something is very, very broken. Wars and natural disasters and traffic accidents and cancer and shootings. And there's abuse and neglect and divorce and loneliness and chronic illness and depression. And we can't escape pain. The world is filled with horrors. But if you're honest, you realize that evils aren't just out there. There are evils in here too. You snap at your child for the 3rd time in a day. And as the words leave your mouth, you're thinking, this isn't who I want to be. Maybe jealousy floods your heart at a friend's success, and for a brief second, you're actually glad when they encounter failure. Or that familiar pattern where you promise yourself, I'm not going to look at that website again, only to find yourself alone in the dark with your screen, breaking that promise for the 100th time. Or a meeting where you take credit for someone else's work, or that conversation where you twist the truth just enough to make yourself look better. That inner dialogue of self-loathing after you drank too much, or spent too much, or ate too much, or smoked too much. That voice that whispers, you'll never change. See, we all stand trial in the courtroom of our own sinfulness. Some days we play the prosecutor, presenting overwhelming evidence of our guilt. Other days, we're the defense attorney, making excuse and shifting blame. Sometimes we're the judge, passing harsh sentences on ourselves or others. But deep down in the stillness of honest reflection, we all know the verdict of sin. And the verdict is guilty. We're desperate for a second chance. We long for mercy. And that's why forgiveness feels like water in a desert when we receive it. Because we know, whether we'd like to admit it or not, that we stand condemned by a standard we cannot meet. We feel the effects of it every single day. Now, let's return to that judgment hall in Jerusalem, the Roman Praetorium. Remember, Jesus isn't the only one on trial that day. In a profound sense, humanity itself stands on trial too. And what's about to unfold reveals God's verdict. And so I want to frame this message as really 3 questions that unveil God's plan for the guilty to go free. And I'll give you a sneak peek to Jesus' answers. In the words of Tim Keller, Jesus' answer to the first question is ambiguous. His answer to the second question is revolutionary. And his answer to the third question is substitutionary. And so one at a time. Pilate's first question cuts to the heart of who Jesus claims to be. I want you to look at Mark 15, verse 1, if you have your Bible. It says, "And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and they led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him," you ready? "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. So here we have Pilate's first question. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, I said the trial of Jesus had moved from the religious to the political realm. And so what the religious guys, the chief priests, were really upset about was Jesus' claim to be God, which they considered to be blasphemy. But it says here that they accused him of many other things. That's because they knew that Pontius Pilate couldn't care less about their little religious squabbles, like who was claiming to be God and who was guilty of blasphemy. Pilate didn't care. He would have laughed them right out of the courtroom. But in Luke's account, we find out that one of the many things that they accused him of, and this is why this was a kangaroo court, because these many things were made up. They were lies. Luke says it this way. He says they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Now this would get Pilate's attention. They say, "Pilate, Jesus was telling people not to pay their taxes. Pilate, we love taxes. We won't tolerate anyone that's telling people not to pay every last penny of taxes to the Romans." Now, this was a total crock, and they knew it. But here's the kicker. In addition to the whole tax thing, they said Jesus is claiming to be a king, which was a big no-no in Rome. There was no king but Caesar. And so this becomes a problem, not of religious consequence, but whether or not Jesus is in any way a political threat. Will this Jesus movement have any political implications? Will Jesus, as a leader, have any impact on the patterns of Rome's political power? That's all Pilate cares about. And during his ministry, there's no question that his movement would have societal implications, for sure. His followers would no doubt disrupt the social order of things. But here, his answer is deliberately ambiguous, and it's more ambiguous than even our English translation suggests, because literally, when he's asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" all he says is, "You said so. You say it," is the original, with the emphasis on the you. Jesus could have said, No. Of course, I'm not a political leader. I'm a spiritual guru. I'm a teacher. I'm a rabbi. All I do is give people spiritual advice, and I give them happiness in their personal lives. And what I'm doing is not going to have any impact on your political order. But he doesn't say that. On the other hand, he also doesn't say, "Yes, of course I'm a political leader." His answer is vague. "I am," he says, "and I'm not. What I'm doing is going to have a lot of political ramifications, but I'm not a political leader in the way that you think of one." So the answer is yes and no. You said so. John's account gives us some more texture in that Jesus says, basically, yes, I'm a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. And so, no, I'm not your kind of king. And it's absolutely crucial that we as Christians stay on this fence. Now listen, not to confuse. I've challenged you many a times to get off the fence, like the fence of belief or unbelief. Get off that fence. Or the fence of all in or half in. Get off this fence. But this is a fence that I want to encourage us to stay on. Like if you would have asked Buddha, are you a political leader? The answer is clear, no. If you were to ask Muhammad, are you a political leader? The answer is clear, yes. When Pilate asked Jesus, are you a political leader? The answer is clear, yes and no. If you don't see the difference between these, you don't understand Christianity. You see, Buddhist leaders will be retreating from society. Many Muslim leaders are trying to take over a society. And Christians, we live on this fence of we're in the world, but we're not of the world. We're working toward the restoration of all things, but this is not our home. We talked about this a couple months ago when Jesus was asked about paying taxes to Caesar, and his conclusion was, essentially, don't withdraw from politics, but don't put all your hope there either. His was a different kind of revolution, a different kind of kingdom than anyone had ever seen. And so if you're running around right now with your hair on fire, screaming and shouting and resisting everything that happens, that the government does, or if you're cheering on every move and digging the knife in the back of all who have their hair on fire running around, can I just say that you're both not understanding Jesus? I think of Mark Sayer's call for Christians to be a non-anxious presence in the midst of all the chaos. Government has a certain authority in our lives, and we can be thankful for that. We can submit to that. But when it asks for our full allegiance, we can confidently and forcefully say that our identity and our citizenship belong to a different kingdom. I like how Joshua Ryan Butler puts it in his book, Party Crasher. Jesus invites you, he says, to bring your lean, but submit your bow. In other words, we can have leanings toward different political perspectives, but our bow, our allegiance, belongs to Jesus. The danger is when that lean becomes a bow, when a different center of your life, in this case your political center, actually becomes your functional God. And this is happening with many Christians, I fear. And we must not give in to this temptation. And so, in response to the question, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answers, I'm a different kind of king. And his ambiguous answer leaves Pilate perplexed. But what confused him even more was Jesus' response to his second question. Look at verse 4 of Mark 15. And Pilate again asked him, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Here's the second question, and I'm summarizing here. But Pilate says, why aren't you fighting back? But Pilate could see what was happening here. And he was like, listen, they're killing you, Jesus. They're railroading you. Look what they're doing. Look at the charges. Look at everything they're doing. Aren't you going to fight back? What's your counter move? What's your strategy here, Jesus? Pilate was a man of the world, and he's trying to figure out what Jesus, this leader, was going to do next. And so you look at his answer, and it's a revolutionary answer. It says, but Jesus made no further answer. So that Pilate was amazed. This word amazed is a positive word. Pilate was not saying, like, you idiot. He wasn't amazed like that. The word has a connotation of wonder and marvel, but Pilate saw something Jesus was doing that amazed him. I believe he saw the contrast between Jesus and Jesus' enemies. On the one hand, his enemies were frantic. They were afraid he was going to get off on the charges, and Jesus is so calm. And on the other hand, his enemies are using power to harm him. And Jesus is actually laying down his power to forgive them. He's exerting power under while they exert power over. And this is pretty astounding because every revolution that has ever happened in the past happens by taking power over and destroying your enemies. And Jesus Christ is about to start a revolution by laying down his power and loving and forgiving his enemies. And Pilate is astounded. Now, we've said all along that Mark's account is a very succinct account, short. But we find out in the other Gospels that there's some more context here. At this point, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. Herod is thoroughly evil, a king. But he's eager to meet Jesus. He's heard of his fame, and Luke tells us that he was kind of hoping for some miracles. He wanted Jesus to come and kind of perform some David Blaine magic tricks for him. But after many questions and continued jeering from the religious leaders, Jesus in front of Herod says nothing, and Herod becomes frustrated. And he's actually a little freaked out that maybe Jesus is the ghost of John the Baptist, who he had previously beheaded. And so Jesus is getting more and more roughed up and ridiculed as the morning wears on, and eventually Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. But one thing becomes clear in all of these gospel accounts, and here's what's clear. Jesus is completely innocent of all charges. Herod finds nothing wrong, and Pilate finds nothing wrong. Luke might say it best in Luke 23:14-16. Pilate says, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him." He says in verse 20, Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. 22, a third time Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death." And so with this as the backdrop, Pilate turns to Jesus in our text and he asks, "Why aren't you fighting back? Why don't you answer these people?" And Jesus gave the most revolutionary answer. He said, "Nothing." Why? Because he was starting a different kind of revolution. Not one of wielding power over others, but one of giving dignity to the powerless. And we see early Christians grabbing a hold of this idea, this revolutionary posture, not because that they had Christians in political power, not because they had lobbied to make sure Christians were running everything, every part of government. No, this was a conspiracy of kindness. This was a subversive grassroots revolution where in a society that didn't value women, for example, in fact, infanticide was rampant. Girl babies were literally thrown out with the trash. Christians came along and gave dignity to babies. They gave dignity to women, saying everyone is conceived in the image of God. In a society where wives had to be faithful to their husbands, but husbands could have as many sexual partners as they wanted, Christians came along and they said that the way of Jesus is that we give dignity to one another in marriage, sexually. There's no double standard. Be faithful to your wife. Honor your wife, husbands. There was also the treatment of the poor and the marginalized. And so, for example, we have this incredible letter from Julian, who was one of the early Roman emperors, who really didn't like Christianity. He was very upset with the success of the movement of Christianity. It was growing and growing, and he couldn't stop it. And so in one of his letters, he writes to a friend and he says, "Our religion is not prospering. The Christian religion is growing. Do you know why it's growing? It's due to their radical care for the poor. Christians do not just, listen to this, take care of their own poor. They take care of our pagan poor as well. Whereas it is obvious for everyone that our poor lack aid even from us." And what Julian was saying, and he was very upset about it, is why can't we pagans take care of the poor the way the Christians can? They don't just take care of their own poor. They take care of our poor too. A radical compassion was sweeping through an entire society and a subversive revolution with it. It's why Jesus' silence before Pilate was so powerful. He was saying, this movement of mine doesn't need all the military power, not all the political power of other movements. It will be fueled by love in the margins and mercy for the helpless and forgiveness for the sinner. And Christianity changed the entire ancient world. And so in response to Pilate's question, why aren't you fighting back? In his silence, Jesus answers, I wield a different kind of power. It's power through surrender. And Pilate's amazed at Jesus, but he still faces this inevitable dilemma. What should be done with this man who refuses now to defend himself? And so he turns to the crowd and offers his third and most consequential question. What shall we do with the king? Look at verse 6. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. He answered them, saying, Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? There's the question. For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him released for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? And they shouted all the more, crucify him. And so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. Having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak. And twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, hail, King of the Jews. And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. Here's today's big idea. The innocent one was sent to die, so the guilty one could go free. What should I do with the King of the Jews? Pilate asks. Should I release him? Why not? What has he done? What should I do with him? What should I do with Jesus? And the surprising answer of the crowd is substitution. Switch him out. We want an exchange. The crowd says, you have a guilty guy in there. His name's Barabbas, a murderer. You have a guilty one and you have an innocent one. Do you know what the last question Pilate asked the crowd right after this? It's what evil has he done? And do you notice what the crowd does? They ignore the question. You know why? Because he had done nothing evil. Not one sin. And so they just yell louder, crucify him. But what has he done? Just crucify him. They don't even answer the question. It's their way of saying, we know he's innocent, but we want him dead. The answer is substitution. There's the innocent, there's the guilty. Switch them. Substitute them. Put the innocent where the guilty should be. Put the guilty where the innocent should be. Take the innocent one and punish him. Take the punishable one and treat him as if he's innocent. Set him free. The guilty one is named Barabbas. Who's Barabbas? Well, all four gospel writers mention this guy. Matthew calls him a notorious prisoner. Mark says that he was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder. Luke says that he was in prison for insurrection and murder. And John adds that he had taken part in a rebellion. And so when Peter preached in Solomon's portico near the temple courts, he called him a murderer. And so the picture we get of this dude was he's this cold-blooded killer. He's a terrorist. He's a menace to society. The word notorious means everybody knew about Barabbas. Prison was where Barabbas belonged. He was there because of heinous crimes, which brings us to another question. Why would anyone want him to be set free? Why did the crowd choose Barabbas? We just heard that Pilate was repeatedly trying to release Jesus. He thought surely this clever little crowd exercise would be his way of releasing Jesus. The charges had been certainly concocted by the insecure religious leaders, but surely the people would free him over putting this bloodthirsty killer back on the streets, wouldn't they? But Pilate severely underestimated the hatred that the religious leaders had stirred up against Jesus. Caiaphas and Annas and the members of the Sanhedrin had cleverly made up their minds long ago. Jesus must die. And so they planned and they plotted and they schemed. All the while their anger simmered and grew and finally boiled over. And when Judas had come to them with his pitiful offer to betray the Lord, they jumped all over it. 30 pieces of silver, piece of cake. And the wheels were set in motion. You see, when a crowd gets whipped up into a frenzy, they can believe the worst about the best. And the facts don't matter anymore. Any student of crowd psychology knows how this works. In fact, we've seen it in a bunch of false flag riots, even in recent times. It only takes 4 or 5 people in strategic places to start the chant, to start the crowd. Give us Barabbas. We want Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. Crucify him. Let the perfect one, let the righteous one, let the holy one die, while the guilty one goes free. And so why did the crowd choose Barabbas? I said it a moment ago. The crowd chose substitution. And in this moment, God our Father and Jesus our Savior also chose substitution. And not just Jesus for Barabbas, but Jesus for all of us. Judah Smith his pastor, had an audio clip that went viral some years ago when he drew this powerful connection. Talking about Barabbas, he said, he's a rebel against wrong, and he's a bad man, a thug, and a crook. He deserves the chains, and he deserves the crucifixion. And Jesus, what has he done but heal and restore and deliver and set free, open blind eyes, open deaf ears, heal the lame and the leper? Well, what has Jesus done? And they say, give us Barabbas. The soldiers come up and they put in the key and they take his chains and unlock Barabbas from his shackles, and he walks down the platform, welcomed by all his thug friends. There's no record of him turning to Jesus and saying, I owe you one. I owe you everything now, for you've set me free. No, you don't see any of that in Barabbas. God knew that ahead of time. And Jesus stood there silent, for he knew the will of his Father. And he said, it's okay, Father, let him have Barabbas. For Jesus knew that the Father would have to treat Jesus like Barabbas so that it would be possible to treat Barabbas like Jesus. Barabbas thought it was the people that set him free. No, it was the love of a heavenly Father. And when you look at this story, you realize who Barabbas really is. That's me. That's you. That's us. And the strange truth is that God loved Barabbas. He's a terrible man, yes, but God loved him. For while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God sent his Son so Barabbas might go free. We've not read the story rightly if we think that Barabbas is bad because he was a criminal and that we are good because we're not like him. I am Barabbas. You are Barabbas. We all are. Murderer, thief, criminal, insurrectionist, lawbreaker, sinner, justly imprisoned, rightly condemned, freed from punishment by a substitute who died in our place. Barabbas stands for me. And how much clearer could Mark be? This is what Jesus' death was all about. He was taking our place. He was taking our guilt. He was taking our sins. He was taking our evil upon himself and being treated the way we should be treated. He died that we might live. He was bound that we might go free. We are Barabbas. Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century first penned the words to one of my very favorite hymns of all time, O Sacred Head, Now Wounded. The second verse speaks to the issue of our sin and the death of Christ. It says, what thou, my Lord, hast suffered was all for sinners' gain. Mine was the transgression, but thine the deadly pain. Lo, here I fall, my Savior, 'tis I deserve thy place. Look on me with thy favor and grant to me thy grace. In answer to Pilate's final question, what shall we do with this king? Jesus answers with his actions, and he says, I apply a different kind of justice. It's the kind of justice where mercy wins over fairness, where innocence takes the place of guilt. And the beauty of the Christian gospel may be seen no more beautifully than in this account. Jesus, the innocent, taking the place of Barabbas, the guilty. A sinner goes free, an innocent man dies. And it is Christ's horrible and holy substitution. When we began today, we talked about the reality of a courtroom of sin that we all find ourselves in. Those moments when we are acutely aware of our failings and shortcomings. The times we snap at our kids and harbor jealousy even against our friends and break promises or bend the truth to our advantage or suffer with addictions. We acknowledge that in our honest moments, we all know the verdict of sin cries guilty. And this is precisely why the story of Jesus and Barabbas resonates so deeply with us. It's not just ancient history. It speaks directly to our condition today and to our future possibilities. Our story intersects with his story right at this very spot. Each of us stands in Barabbas' position. We know our guilt. We recognize our deserved punishment. And yet, through Christ's sacrifice, we are offered freedom, not because justice was abandoned, but because it was fulfilled through a beautiful exchange, a horrible and holy substitution. See, the profound truth of the gospel is this: Jesus took what we deserved so that we could receive what he deserved. He took our guilt so that we could have his righteousness. He took our punishment so that we could have his peace. This is why Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. This substitution is at the very heart of the Christian faith. This is such good news for us, friends. This is relieving news, by the way, to a younger generation who is dead set on finding meaning within themselves, finding purpose within themselves, finding identity within themselves. Do you know what kind of pressure this takes off of you? To know that freedom doesn't come from within you. It can only come from outside you, from the one who loves you, from the one who gave himself for you. But this salvation is not automatic and it's not universal. Christ's salvation is sealed with a decision, a response that you and I make to his grace. It's offered to everyone, but you must receive it in faith and then let it transform you from the inside out. And so the question that Pilate asked the crowd remains our question today. What shall I do with King Jesus? And your answer to that question determines everything about your present life and your future eternity. And so I want to invite your host to come now and to lead you through a time of response. I love you guys so much.